A young woman moves like a shadow through her late father's townhouse, her beauty hidden beneath a mourning veil, her fate gripped by a jealous stepmother. At a candlelit supper, the most feared earl in Ireland offers marriage with a voice of ice. No courtship, no tenderness, only a bargain. From that moment, whispers coil through corridors. What truth lies behind the veil? Which wound freezes his heart? And when duty and desire collide, which will she choose? Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from, and share. What draws you to historical romance, the forbidden glances, the ruthless intrigue, or the triumph of love against the odds? Dublin, the year of our Lord 1600. The skies hung low above the narrow lanes of the merchant quarter, casting a veil of winter over the city, much like the one that shrouded Bridget O'Callaghan's face. In the dim light of her father's townhouse, draped still in black crepe and the scent of fading lilies, Bridget moved like a ghost, silent, obedient, and unseen. She had not spoken much since the burial. Her voice, once soft as prayer, had been swallowed by the weight of grief and the cruel hush of her stepmother's rule. Lady Nuala O'Callaghan, elegant and venomous, had wasted no time. The very evening the final shovelful of dirt landed upon her husband's coffin, Nuala had summoned the estate solicitor, claimed authority over the household, and banished all of Bridget's personal belongings to a smaller chamber overlooking the stables. "Beauty breeds misfortune," Nuala had whispered as she pinned the black lace veil to Bridget's hair, with fingers too gentle to be kind. "Best you remain hidden, for your own sake." "And mine?" Bridget did not protest. She never did. She merely lowered her eyes and obeyed, as she had been trained to do since the age of 11, when Nuala had entered their lives with perfume, pearls, and promises of grace. The townhouse had once held warmth, bookshelves lined with her father's favorites, fires that crackled merrily in the hearth, the soft music of laughter in the drawing room. Now it echoed. Shadows lingered where music had once danced. Servants walked on tiptoe, eyes lowered, mouths tight, and Bridget, clad in grey wool and mourning netting, wandered its corridors like a relic from a better time. That afternoon, as the fog clung to the windows and the church bells tolled for vespers, Nuala summoned her to the withdrawing room. "You will dress for supper tonight," she declared, her voice like wine poured over ice. "A guest of importance joins us. You are to sit and speak only when spoken to." Bridget nodded, her stomach tightening. She had no appetite for food, much less for guests. Nuala's gown shimmered like garnet flames under candlelight, too vibrant for mourning, too bold for a widow. Her hair, a sculpture of golden red coils and pearl pins, cast shadows over her face. Bridget stood beside her, a shadow in deep grey, her veil secured, her fingers trembling beneath her skirts. The dining room had been prepared with unusual elegance. The table gleamed with polished silver and fresh laurel, a nod to status more than hospitality. The fire burned low, and the scent of roasted meat mingled with rosemary and something less comforting: apprehension. When the guest arrived, the very air in the room seemed to shift. The footman announced his name with a note of awe: Earl Seamus Rathmore. Bridget's eyes, though half obscured by lace, found him instantly. He was not a man made for polite company. Tall and clad in dark wool and leather, with a silver-stitched doublet and boots worn from long roads, the Earl of Rathmore carried himself not like a courtier, but a soldier returned from war. His eyes, ice blue and unblinking, swept the room and settled on her as if measuring the distance between silence and surrender. He bowed to Nuala, offered a faint nod to Bridget, and took his place at the head of the table as though the house already belonged to him. The supper passed in brittle conversation. Nuala performed her role with calculated charm, boasting of her late husband's legacy, lamenting the burden of guardianship over a daughter so frail and withdrawn. Bridget remained silent, her face hidden behind her veil, her heart pounding in quiet rebellion. But it was near the end of the meal, as the wine was poured and the fire began to fade to embers, that everything shifted. The Earl set down his goblet and turned to Lady Nuala. His voice was low, deliberate, no hint of sentiment in it. I find myself in need of a wife, one who is discreet, uncomplicated, loyal. I believe the girl at your side will do." Bridget's breath caught. Nula's smile bloomed, slow and triumphant. "You flatter us, my lord. Bridget will be honored." No one asked Bridget. No one even turned to her. Her hands trembled beneath the tablecloth, her spoons slipping from her fingers and clattering onto her plate like a bell, tolling the end of something sacred. She wanted to cry out, but no sound emerged. The veil, as ever, muffled more than her beauty. It muted her very self. When the Earl rose to leave, he paused beside her chair. "You need not speak," he murmured, not unkindly, but without warmth. "A quiet bride suits me well." Bridget lowered her gaze, not in shame, not yet in fear, but in resignation. That night, alone in her chamber, she removed the veil and stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror above the washstand. The girl who looked back was pale, haunted, but still there. "I am still here," she whispered aloud for the first time in weeks. And though no one heard her voice, the walls remembered, and perhaps, just perhaps, so would he. The morning after the proposal arrived like a mournful echo from a dream one had not wished to remember. Frost clung to the window panes of the small bedchamber where Bridget O'Callaghan now slept alone. The once elegant townhouse of her childhood seemed colder, quieter, as if the very walls anticipated the turning of her fate. No fire burned in the hearth. No voice called her to breakfast. Even the maid who entered to draw the curtains moved without speaking, her eyes carefully avoiding Bridget's. Wrapped in a woolen shawl, Bridget sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her thoughts circled like crows around a battlefield. Last night, her future had been signed away with a nod and a wine-stained smile. "I find myself in need of a wife. I believe the girl at your side will do." The words had pierced her deeper than she allowed anyone to see, and the silence that followed, Nula's silence, her own, had sealed her fate like a stone lid upon a crypt. Yet now, in the privacy of her chamber, Bridget's chest rose with a breath of something dangerously close to defiance. She could not, she would not, let this happen without a voice, even if her voice shook. By the time she descended the staircase to the main drawing room, her veil was fastened neatly, her hands folded with studied poise. Lady Nula sat beside the fireplace, a steaming cup of tea in one hand and a letter in the other. The light of the fire painted golden tones across her auburn hair and the rich emerald fabric of her robe. She looked less like a grieving widow and more like a queen awaiting homage. Bridget stepped forward. "I wish to speak with you." Nula raised her eyes slowly, arching a brow with the elegance of a woman who knew her power and had long stopped pretending otherwise. "I have nothing to wear to a wedding," Bridget said, her tone calm but resolute, "because I never agreed to one." The silence that followed was brittle as glass. Nula set down her teacup with a grace so deliberate it rang louder than any shout. "Do not confuse obedience with privilege, Bridget," she replied softly. "You were given a rare opportunity, one most girls in your position would crawl to accept. I don't wish to marry him. You don't need to wish anything. You are not marrying for wishes." Bridget's hands trembled beneath the folds of her gown, but she did not retreat. "He's a stranger. A powerful stranger," Nula said, rising now. "An earl, a man who, despite his reputation, has made a respectable and generous offer. And let us not pretend that your options are bountiful, or that your presence in this house is anything but tolerated." It was cruel, and it was the truth. Bridget's lips parted, but Nula took a step closer, her voice lowering like a blade sliding from its sheath. "I tire of this performance, child. You are not some noble heiress with choices and dowries. You are a burden, one I am no longer obliged to carry. Be grateful that Lord Rathmore's needs are simple, and that your face, when hidden, still tempts curiosity." Bridget's breath caught behind her veil. "You will marry him," Nula concluded, returning to her seat, "and you will do so with your head bowed and your mouth closed." Later that day, the great doors of the townhouse opened once more, and Earl Seamus Rathmore stepped into the parlour like a gust of winter wind. He removed his gloves slowly, one finger at a time, before offering a nod of civility to Nuala, who simpered with false warmth. Bridget stood by the window, as still as the lace curtain beside her, watching the man whose name now hovered over her future like a storm cloud. "May I speak with her?" the Earl asked, his voice low but firm. Nuala hesitated, just for a heartbeat, then waved her hand with performative generosity. "Of course. Take the east study. It is private enough." Bridget followed the Earl through the long corridor, the heels of his boots striking the stone floor with unwavering rhythm. Inside the study, he turned to face her, but made no move to close the door. "You may remove your veil," he said. She did not move. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the ticking of a mantel clock and the distant caw of a crow beyond the frosted window. "I was not informed this marriage would require affection," Bridget said finally, her voice soft yet clear. "It doesn't," the Earl replied. "I require a wife, not a companion." Bridget looked at him, truly looked, and found not cruelty, but calculation. His eyes did not wander, his stance did not intimidate. He spoke with the precision of a man who had lost the use for softness. "You will have a place of comfort," he continued. "Clothes, servants, a carriage. No hand will be raised to you, no public humiliation. In exchange, I expect your presence at events where a wife is expected, and your absence where she is not." Bridget's fingers curled at her sides. "And what of conversation?" "I do not require it." He was honest, brutally so. Yet somewhere in his detachment there was a strange and terrible mercy. He did not promise her love, nor ask for her trust. He made no pretense of romance or tenderness. He simply made a bargain. She lowered her eyes, the veil obscuring the blur of her lashes. "I understand," she whispered. That night, Bridget wandered into the chapel, tucked at the rear of the property. A place once meant for prayer now stood mostly abandoned. Its candles burned low, its air heavy with dust and forgotten psalms. But Father Colum O'Shea remained, kneeling in the shadows, his hands clasped tightly, his face aged not by years, but by the weight of all he had witnessed. He looked up when she entered, and something in his eyes softened. "Bridget," he said gently, "I had hoped you would come." She sat beside him in the first pew, hands folded over her knees. The silence between them was familiar, filled with things too heavy to name. "I am to be married," she said after a long moment. "Yes," he replied. "You knew?" "I was told." She looked toward the altar, its faded cloth and dusty lilies. "Does it not seem strange to you to offer one's life to a man who does not want it, only what it represents?" Father Colum sighed, the sound weary but kind. "There is much about Lord Rathmore that appears strange, but you must know, what you see is not all there is." She turned her head slightly, curiosity breaking through the veil of resignation. "Then what is there? Loss, loneliness, wounds that no soldier can name." He paused, "And perhaps a soul who never learned the language of gentleness." Bridget's throat tightened. "What can such a man do with a wife?" "That," Father Colum said with a sad smile, "will depend on what the wife chooses to do with the man." As she left the chapel, the cold air met her face with the sharpness of truth. She paused at the top of the steps, her hand tightening on the banister. The townhouse behind her, the world ahead, and between them, a veil, a symbol of silence, of shadows, of bargains made without heart. That night, sleep did not come. She sat at the window until the frost faded into mist and the pale light of dawn touched the stone courtyards below. And somewhere deep within her chest, beneath the bruises of silence and the aching weight of fear, something flickered. It was not hope, not yet, but it was the beginning of a question. What if I am more than what they see? And the darkness, for the first time, did not answer back. It was a wedding without music, without laughter, without even the courtesy of sunlight. A veil of mist clung to the streets of Dublin on the morning Bridget O'Callaghan was given to a man who had not asked for her heart. The sky hung heavy and colourless above the old cathedral, its stones darkened by centuries of sorrow. Within its cold walls, the echoes of Latin prayers drifted like incense, hollow, distant, perfunctory. Bridget stood before the altar like a statue carved of ash. Her face, as always, was hidden beneath the mourning veil, the lace darker than any joy and finer than any mercy. The gown she wore had once belonged to her mother, remade and recut at Lady Newla's command until no trace of warmth remained in its seams. It clung to her like a memory half erased. The Earl of Rathmore stood beside her, silent and still, dressed in black so rich and severe it swallowed the candlelight. He did not touch her hand until the priest commanded it. He did not glance her way until the vow was spoken, and even then he did not lift the veil. When the ring slid onto her finger, cold and tight as a shackle, Bridget felt her breath falter. She did not weep, she did not speak, she simply endured. There was no feast, no receiving line, only the scent of wet stone and extinguished candles as they exited the church and stepped into the waiting carriage. Newla remained behind, her part in the tale now complete, her mission fulfilled. Inside the carriage, Seamus Rathmore did not offer her a word. He did not meet her gaze. He sat across from her, arms crossed, staring out the window as though the landscape offered more conversation than the woman he had just married. They travelled in silence, the wheels grinding over frost-bitten roads until the city gave way to distant fields and the first misty outlines of Rathmore Hall appeared on the horizon. The manor was no fairy tale castle. Built of dark limestone and guarded by wild hedgerows, it rose from the earth like a monument to restraint. No colourful banners, no music to welcome a new bride, only a grey sky, the scent of burning peat, and the cawing of unseen crows. As the carriage pulled into the gravel drive, Bridget's fingers tightened around the folds of her skirt. The great oak doors opened slowly, revealing a steward in muted livery, and two footmen who bowed with practiced indifference. No one welcomed her. No one said her name. Inside, the manor was cold as still. The stone floors gleamed with discipline. The tapestries were old, faded, and chosen for function rather than beauty. Only the drawing room bore signs of life, a low burning hearth, a library of worn books, and the scent of tobacco lingering in the air. The housekeeper, a severe woman with iron hair and a stiff spine, led Bridget through the corridors. "Your chamber is in the west wing," she announced without eye contact. "You will take meals in the small dining parlour unless instructed otherwise. The master requests privacy. Always knock before entering his study." Bridget followed without speaking, the hem of her gown brushing the stone like a whisper no one wished to hear. Her room was large but barren. Pale grey walls, a narrow bed with plain linens, a small writing table, and one shuttered window facing the trees. There were no flowers, no mirror, no fire. When the door closed behind her, Bridget stood in the centre of the room, surrounded by stillness, and felt herself vanish. Days passed, or perhaps only moments disguised as days. Breakfasts arrived on trays, dinners were taken at opposite ends of a long table where Seamus read correspondence and Bridget picked at food she could not taste. They spoke only of necessity, of hours, of instructions, never of memories, never of dreams, yet his presence weighed upon the air. Each time she entered a room, he seemed already there, half-shadowed, half-watching. His eyes, those glacial, unreadable eyes, lingered too long when she removed her gloves, when she stood beside the fire, when she reached for a book in the library. He never touched her, never smiled. But in his stillness she felt the edges of something unnamed. She tried not to notice, but she noticed everything. His hands, marked by old scars, always clean and precise. His voice, measured, always formal, except when he thought himself alone, pacing the corridor outside his study late at night, whispering something too faint to hear. His coat hung neatly by the door, even when the hearth remained unlit. And the way he never corrected anyone who called her Lady Rathmore, but never used the name himself. Then, one evening, something changed. She returned from a walk through the frost-laced gardens, her cheeks pink from the cold, her veil damp with mist. Her boots left quiet prints on the floor as she entered her chamber, ready to surrender to solitude once more. But there, upon her writing desk, lay a letter, folded once, sealed with no crest, the handwriting unfamiliar, angular, restrained. She hesitated, then opened it. There was no greeting, no signature, only the inked confession of a soul stripped bare. There are days when silence feels like a blade too dull to kill and too sharp to ignore. I've known the noise of battle, the cries of the dying, the roar of command, but I have never feared any sound more than the quiet of my own walls. You are not the cause, but your presence makes the silence feel louder. Forgive me, if you can, for not knowing what to do with peace. Bridget read the words again and again. Her fingers trembled. Her breath caught on the line. Your presence makes the silence feel louder. There was no name, no proof, but her heart, cautious and bruised, dared to believe. Someone had written to her, not the dutiful wife, not the veiled stranger. Her. She pressed the letter to her chest and sat at the window, staring into the darkened grove beyond the garden wall. There were no stars, no wind, only the rustle of dried leaves and the echo of a voice she had never heard speak in such a way. A voice that perhaps saw her, not through duty, not through design, but through the veil. She did not sleep that night. She did not need to, because for the first time since the vows were spoken, she felt less alone. Not yet loved, not yet known, but seen. And in that fragile recognition, buried beneath stone and silence, something ancient and tender stirred. A beginning. The days at Rathmore Hall unfolded with the hush of snow settling upon forgotten ground. Though winter had not yet descended in full, the chill inside the manor was more than seasonal. It was structural. Every corridor whispered with silence. Every chamber seemed to hold its breath, and Bridget O'Callaghan, newlywed and still veiled in more ways than one, began to walk those halls with a quiet that matched the house itself. She rose early, long before the sun dared to touch the frosted windows. Wrapped in her cloak of grey wool, her steps light upon the flagstones, she wandered beyond the limits of her assigned space. No one stopped her. No one guided her. It was as though the house both permitted and ignored her presence. A ghost drifting among ghosts. On the third morning of her wanderings, she reached the east corridor, a passage dimmer than the rest, where portraits hung in tight silence and the dust had not been disturbed in some time. Here, the air felt heavier, as though grief had settled into the very mortar. She paused at the final door, a tall, arched frame of dark oak sealed shut, its handle dulled with age. Curious, Bridget reached for it. It did not open. Later that day, in the dining parlour, she dared to ask the Earl, as they sat at opposite ends of the long table, their meal untouched. "There is a room in the east corridor. It appears sealed." Seamus's fork stilled over his plate. "Some doors are not meant to be opened," he said, his tone clipped. She met his gaze, not in defiance, not in challenge, only in curiosity. Was it hers? The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly. "I will thank you," he replied, voice low and razor-thin, "not to trespass where your presence was not invited." Bridget nodded, her pulse quickening. He rose from the table without another word. That night, the wind howled against the windows, like a creature begging to be let inside. Bridget sat at her writing desk, trembling slightly, not from cold, but from something she could not name. And there, waiting once more, was another letter. This one was longer. "You asked about the room. It is a tomb, not of flesh, but of memory. I do not speak of her, not to others, not even to myself. There are parts of me that were buried with her, parts that do not deserve resurrection. Yet you ask, and I find that I do not want to silence you. I do not know what to make of that." Her hands trembled as she read. He had written it. She was certain now. There was no other voice that could carry such restraint and such ache in the same breath. In the weeks that followed, the letters continued, each left with no ceremony, no signature, only words, and the weight they carried, each one revealing more of a man she had never seen, without armor. Thoughts of war, of faith, of loyalty and betrayal, and loneliness, woven into every phrase like a thread of sorrow he could not untangle. She said nothing aloud, not to the maids, not to the housekeeper, not even to Father Colum, who visited only once during those days and left with eyes shadowed by concern. But she overheard things. One afternoon, she passed the servants' gallery and heard Mrs. Foy, the stern housekeeper, whispering to the younger maid as they folded linens, "She writes to someone. I see the ink stains. The master reads them, leaves replies." "You're certain as winter follows fall. But don't speak of it. He would not take kindly to prying." Bridget's cheeks flushed, not with shame, with something dangerously close to hope. Later that week, she entered the chapel alone. It was a place she had begun to favor in the early afternoons, when the sun cast its gentlest light through the stained glass, painting silent mosaics on the stone floor. She sat in the first pew, eyes closed, hands clasped, not in prayer, but in reflection. She had barely risen when the dizziness struck, a wave of heat, a ringing in her ears, then nothing. When she awoke, she was not on the cold floor, but in his arms, Seamus. She felt the strength of his grip beneath her back, the way his breath rushed in hurried, uneven bursts. Her head lay against his chest, her veil askew, her pulse unsteady. "Stay still," he murmured, not a command, a plea. Her eyes fluttered open, finding his face above hers, closer than it had ever been. There was panic there, barely masked, but also something else, something raw, unspoken. She began, but he shook his head. "Don't speak. You fainted. I found you in the chapel." His voice was rough with concern, no longer cold, no longer distant. He carried her through the halls without ceremony, past the staff, past the portraits, through the silence, and no one dared to follow. Back in her chamber, he placed her gently on the bed, pulled a blanket around her shoulders, lit the fire himself, waited until her breathing steadied, then left without a word. That night, as the fire crackled softly and her body slowly regained strength, Bridget sat at her desk and stared at the letter he had left the day before. She had read it so many times the edges were worn, and for the first time, she wrote back. No greeting, no name, just her hand on the page, firm and unshaking. "You speak of memory as though it is a prison, but I believe it can also be a lantern, a way forward, if you choose to light it. I do not seek to open what is sealed, only to understand what breathes beneath the surface." She folded the letter, left it where his last one had been. No signature, no expectations, only truth. And in the hours before sleep claimed her, she did not dream of escape, nor of romance. She dreamt of being seen fully, without the veil, without the silence, without fear. And though morning had not yet broken, she sensed it would come differently this time, because the echoes in the hall had changed. They no longer whispered of loss. They whispered her name. The wind came from the north that morning, sharp, metallic, heavy with foreboding. It swept through the trees surrounding Rathmore Hall, rattling the shutters and sighing against the stone like a mournful messenger. The fire in Bridget's room burned low despite the careful stacking of peat, and the hem of her gown trembled as she walked across the floor, as though her very presence stirred something unspoken in the air. She had begun to write without hesitation now. Every evening, when the house fell silent and only the rhythm of the clock broke the hush, Bridget O'Callaghan sat at her desk and poured herself into words. Some letters were returned with answers, others disappeared without acknowledgement. But she kept writing, not out of expectation, but out of need. It had become the only way to feel tethered to something beyond herself, something real. And then, quite suddenly, Father Colum O'Shea returned. She saw his arrival from the drawing-room window, his figure hunched beneath a dark cloak, his steps purposeful, his presence unmistakable. The gates of Rathmore creaked open as though recognizing an old friend who came bearing both comfort and unrest. She met him in the front hall, where the servant stepped aside with reverence. The light through the high windows cast golden shapes across the stone, and for a moment Bridget felt as though the house had exhaled, acknowledging the presence of a man who spoke little but meant much. "Father," she said gently, her voice warmer than it had been in days. "I didn't know you were coming." He nodded, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Nor did I, child. But when the soul pulls you somewhere, you follow." They sat together in the small chapel shortly after, where the scent of incense still lingered faintly from her last visit. The stained glass glowed in soft tones, painting her profile in flickers of crimson and gold. Father Colum studied her for a long while before speaking. "There's trouble in the north," he said, folding his hands. "More than before. The crown is tightening its grip. Monasteries are being seized. Men taken without warrant. They say it is for the good of order." Bridget's heart twisted. "And the people? Afraid, divided, angry." He looked toward the altar. "I fear a reckoning is coming, one not born of faith, but of desperation." She lowered her gaze. "And Lord Rathmore?" The question hung in the air like mist. Colum's eyes turned to her, tired, knowing, kind. He knows too well what desperation can do. He paused, then said with care, "You asked once what wounded him. I believe it is time you knew." He leaned forward, voice hushed and weighted with reverence. 5 years ago, his estate in Ulster was set to be raided. There were rumors of rebellion, whispers that Rathmore housed documents, or gold, or sympathizers. He had been away for days, called south for negotiations. When he returned, the house was ash. Rebels had set fire to it. His wife, Maeve, and their young son, Thomas, had been locked inside. Bridget gasped, one hand lifting to her chest, fingers tightening over her bodice. They said it was an accident, that they meant to burn the records, that they didn't know anyone was home. He exhaled slowly. But grief does not understand intentions. It only understands loss. Her vision blurred. The weight of that knowledge settled on her like a stone placed upon a fragile shelf. It explained the silences, the distance, the coldness that was never cruel but always measured, as though he were guarding himself from anything that could fracture him further. Father Colum reached for her hand, holding it gently between his own. "Do not mistake his silence for indifference. Some men speak with words, others with restraint." Bridget's lips parted, but no answer came. Her throat felt tight, her breath unsteady. That evening, long after Colum had gone and the house had returned to its nightly stillness, Bridget stood at her writing desk beneath the flickering light of the oil lamp. The fire had died down. Her chamber was quiet, but her thoughts were a storm. She unfolded a fresh sheet of parchment, dipped her quill into ink, and without hesitation began to write, not as a stranger, but as someone who now knew the shadow behind the man. "You have carried a grief no words could soften. I do not write to open wounds, nor to steal from you the privacy that has protected you all these years. I write because silence should not be your only companion. I do not fear the fire that has shaped you. I fear only that you believe you must walk through it alone. If these letters trouble you, I will stop, but if they bring you the faintest comfort, I will continue, not as your wife by duty, but as a voice willing to remain when others fled." She paused. Her eyes welled with tears, though none fell. Then, at the bottom of the page, she signed only with a single cross, deliberate, personal, sacred. She folded it carefully, placed it in the usual spot on her desk, and blew out the lamp. Sleep came slowly. She lay in bed, staring at the low flames in the hearth, her mind spinning with images she had never seen, but now felt with aching clarity. A woman in a burning room, a child's cry lost in smoke, a man on horseback arriving too late to save what he loved most. She awoke at dawn. The sky outside her window was veiled in mist, and frost glistened on the glass like lace. She sat up slowly, unsure whether to hope or fear, and then she saw it. A folded note, left where hers had been. Her breath caught. She reached for it, hands trembling, and opened it with the reverence one might give to scripture. There was only one sentence: "Your words, are braver than your eyes." Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling the sound that rose from her throat. It was not quite a sob, not quite a gasp, something between grief and astonishment. She clutched the letter to her chest, her fingers trembling. It was him. It had always been him. And now she knew with certainty that he had been reading her, just as she had been reading him. The distance between them had not vanished. It remained, a sea, wide and cold. But now there was a bridge built of ink and silence, fragile and true. From that day forward, the air between them shifted. He still said little, but his eyes lingered longer. His presence, though spare, felt more present. There were moments at dinner when he paused before sitting, as though waiting for her to move first. His hand brushed hers once as he passed her a dish, and he did not pull away too quickly. And sometimes, in the corridors of Rathmore, she felt his gaze upon her back, not with suspicion, but with something unspoken. She continued to write, and so did he. They wrote not as husband and wife in a conventional sense, but as two strangers discovering the courage to be seen. One letter at a time, one truth at a time. And though no word of love had yet been spoken, Bridget sensed that what grew between them was no longer born of duty. It was becoming something far more dangerous, something that had the power to heal or destroy. But for now, it was simply this, a voice in the dark. An echo returned. The wind came with a roar that night, not a whispering breeze nor a sullen moan, but a furious cry from the heavens. Trees bowed beneath it, their limbs rattling like bones. Rain lashed the stone walls of Rathmore Hall, hammering windows and flooding the grounds until the gardens became rivers and the courtyard a lake of blackened glass. The storm was no visitor. It was a conqueror. Within the estate, candles flickered in hallways, tapestries rustled as though alive. Servants moved in hushed urgency, checking shutters, bolting doors. And high in her chamber, Bridget O'Callaghan stood at the window, her heart pounding with a rhythm not entirely born of fear. She had never seen such violence in the sky. Forks of silver split the darkness, illuminating the estate in bursts of ghostly fire. Thunder cracked like cannon fire. The shadows in the room trembled with each explosion of sound. Then came the creaking, not from her chamber, but distant, deep within the east wing. Something forgotten had been left unlatched. Bridget stepped back from the window and wrapped her cloak around her shoulders. Her maid had not come that evening, the storm delaying or distracting the staff. No one had brought her supper. No one had knocked. She lit her lamp and stepped out into the corridor. The east wing had always felt different from the rest of Rathmore, older, quieter, untouched by warmth. Since her discovery of the sealed room, she had avoided it, sensing the depth of pain it held. But tonight, it called to her, not as a place of memory, but as a place in need. The wind howled louder down that corridor, seeping through the joints of the stone, like a cry seeking comfort. As she moved deeper into the passage, her lamp flickered, the flame struggling to survive the drafts. And then she saw it. A window near the sealed chamber had blown open. The rain lashed in, soaking the stone floor and chilling the air. Curtains whipped like wounded birds. Bridget rushed forward, slipping slightly on the wet stone as she reached for the iron latch. The storm fought her. The window resisted. Rain struck her face and veil, plastering both to her skin. Her cloak was soaked, her fingers frozen, and just as she managed to force the window shut, a voice behind her. "Bridget!" She turned. Seamus Rathmore stood at the other end of the corridor, his figure backlit by a flickering sconce. He had no coat. His shirt was partially unbuttoned, the sleeves rolled to his forearms. His hair was damp from the storm, as though he too had just come from battle. Their eyes locked across the darkened hall. He took a step forward, then another, until he reached her. "You could have fallen," he said, his voice low and tight. "You should not be here alone." "I thought no one else would come," she replied, her breath visible in the cold. Rain continued to beat against the walls. The wind screamed outside. But here, in the narrow passage, there was only the sound of their breathing. She pulled her wet veil from her face. It clung to her like a second skin, and held it in her hand. His eyes followed the motion. Then she did something she had never done. Slowly, without ceremony, without fear, Bridget removed the veil completely. Her face, pale and damp, was bare before him. Her hair clung to her temples. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold and effort. Her lips trembled, though not from the storm. And her eyes, deep, clear, unguarded, met his with a steadiness that shook him more than thunder. Seamus inhaled sharply, as though the very sight of her had stolen the air from his chest. She did not lower her gaze. "I grow tired of hiding," she whispered, "even if it is easier." For a long moment he said nothing. Then, softly, "You should never have had to." He reached out as if to touch her cheek, but stopped just short, his fingers hovering near her skin, uncertain. The air between them pulsed with a quiet intensity that neither dared name. His hand dropped. "You're shivering," he said. "I'm soaked." "Come." He guided her gently down the hall, his hand resting at her back, not forceful, but present. When they reached the main staircase, he called for a servant, his voice calm but resolute. Blankets, towels, tea, warmth. Within half an hour, Bridget sat in the drawing room by the fire, a shawl wrapped tightly around her, a cup of tea warming her hands. Her veil lay discarded beside her on the arm of the chair. Seamus did not leave. He stood by the hearth, watching the flames, his posture tense, as if bracing for something neither of them could name. At last he spoke. "Tomorrow, dine with me, at the main table, as my equal." She blinked. "Your equal?" His eyes met hers. "You are no longer a guest, nor a stranger." A pause. "If you ever were." She said nothing. But something within her stirred, a mixture of fear and relief, of vulnerability and triumph, and when she rose to return to her chamber, she left the veil behind. The next evening, the dining hall was prepared, not grandly, but intentionally. Candles were lit, silver polished, a modest meal set between them. Bridget entered wearing a simple gown of midnight blue, her hair drawn back in soft curls. No lace, no netting, no shadow. Seamus stood when she entered. The gesture was small, but profound. He pulled out her chair, and for the first time they dined as husband and wife in truth, not performance. The conversation was tentative at first. Questions about the grounds, her thoughts on music, his comments on the recent harvest. Then a shared memory of a snowfall years past, followed by quiet laughter, brief, uncertain, real. The ice between them did not melt. It cracked slowly, gently, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath. After the meal, they walked once around the great hall. Not touching, not speaking much, but walking, side by side. When she retired, he did not follow, but when she reached her chamber, she found something waiting at her desk. A folded note. She opened it with trembling hands. "You were right. Hiding is easier, but easier has never meant better." Bridget smiled. Not fully, not yet, but enough. The veil had fallen, and in its place, the beginning of something that needed no disguise. The days that followed the storm unfolded in strange stillness. The corridors of Rathmore Hall, once cloaked in suspicion and silence, had begun to breathe again. Gentle footsteps echoed with less restraint. Bridget no longer drifted like a wraith veiled in shadows. She walked uncovered, unveiled, her figure soft against the hard lines of the ancient estate. But peace, as always, was a fragile thing. It came with no warning, only the sudden roll of carriage wheels on wet gravel and the sharp cry of the footman announcing a guest. Lady Nuala O'Callaghan had returned. She arrived wrapped in velvet and deception, her travelling cloak lined in fox fur, her golden red hair untouched by wind, not a single curl out of place. Her gloved hands rested delicately upon the handle of her parasol, though the day was grey with rain and no sun shone above. Behind her followed two attendants, each carrying luggage far too grand for a visit she had not announced. Bridget stood at the top of the stairs when the doors opened. She had not expected to see Nuala again, Not at Rathmore, not after the way she had been handed off like an unwanted letter sealed in wax. But the woman who stepped inside did not carry the expression of someone dismissed. She carried entitlement, confidence, strategy. "My dearest Bridget," Nuala cooed, as if they had parted with kisses and kind words. "How pale you've become. Does the country air not suit you?" Bridget descended the stairs slowly, her hands composed at her sides, though her heart had leapt into her throat. "I wasn't expecting you." Nuala smiled with a softness that never touched her eyes. Clearly, she claimed the blue parlour without invitation and ordered tea as though still mistress of the household. Seamus was out on estate business, overseeing repairs along the riverbank, leaving Bridget to receive her stepmother alone. They sat across from one another, two women separated by history, betrayal and blood not shared. The silence between them was brittle as porcelain. "I've heard whispers in town," Nuala said lightly, stirring her tea with exaggerated elegance, "that the Earl has taken a liking to his bride." Bridget said nothing. "Quite the turn, don't you think? From veiled shadow to lady of the manor. Tell me, does he call you by your name, or does he still prefer titles and silence?" Bridget met her gaze without flinching. "Why are you here?" "Why? To see how you've settled, of course." She tilted her head. "You are family, after all." But the poison had already begun to seep. By the second day of Nuala's stay, the house changed. Subtly, quietly. Maids who had once smiled at Bridget now avoided her eyes. Conversations ceased when she entered a room. Trays were delivered late. Her shawls misplaced. A book she had left in the library returned to her chamber soaked through. One afternoon, she passed by two scullery maids whispering behind the doorframe and caught only fragments of what was said. "She keeps him up at night. With those eyes, always watching. I heard she'd bewitched him." That evening, she found her mourning veil missing. It had been folded carefully in the bottom drawer of her wardrobe. She had kept it not out of sentiment, but as a relic of the woman she had once been. It was gone, and beside her writing desk, on the floor where she kept her small wooden box of keepsakes, she found her mother's cross, broken in two. She stared at the pieces in her hand, her fingers trembling. The carved grain of the wood, once polished with memory and prayer, now split down the center like a wound reopened. Someone had entered her chamber, and they wanted her to know. That night, she could not sleep. She sat near the window, eyes fixed on the rain streaking the glass, and listened to every creak of the floorboards outside her door. She felt watched, even in her solitude. The warmth that had begun to return to Rathmore now felt like an illusion, pulled away by unseen hands. When Seamus returned the next morning, she told him, softly, carefully, "There have been things, missing, broken, whispers." She looked up from her tea, her voice steadier than she expected. "And I believe it began the day Lady Nuala arrived." His eyes narrowed. "You're accusing your own kin? She is not my blood, and she's never been my family." Seamus set down his cup with more force than necessary. "And what would be her motive, Bridget? To unmake me?" He studied her face. Then, instead of reaching for reassurance, he rose from his seat and paced toward the hearth. "And who told you the servants were whispering?" he asked. "I heard them. People hear what they wish to believe." His tone was sharper now, colder. The distance she thought had begun to close between them widened with a single glance. "I found my cross broken, my veil taken." "Are you certain?" he said, turning to her. "Not mislaid, not simply forgotten in a drawer." Her breath caught. "You think I invented it?" "I think," he said, voice dangerously calm, "that I have known women who feign innocence better than they speak truth." The words struck her with the weight of betrayal. The heat drained from her cheeks, her throat closed. "I am not them," she whispered. He did not reply, and that silence hurt more than the accusation. She left the room without waiting to be dismissed, her steps slow, measured, her dignity barely holding its shape. Back in her chamber, she closed the door, leaned her back against it, and pressed a hand to her chest, as if she could steady the break forming inside her. Tears threatened, but did not fall. She would not give Nuala the satisfaction. But that night, when she sat to write a letter, she could not lift the pen. Her hands refused to move. The words would not come. For the first time since their exchange of ink and longing began, she left her desk bare. And in the silence that followed, the house turned cold again, as if it too had decided to stop speaking. The rain returned with vengeance. It came not as cleansing nor comfort, but as a furious reckoning from the sky, sharp, wild, and unrelenting. Thunder cracked above Rathmore Hall like the shattering of iron gates. Lightning tore open the clouds and cast the land in fractured silver, exposing the rawness of a world that could no longer pretend calm. And within its walls, Bridget O'Callaghan could no longer pretend either. The words Seamus had spoken days before still echoed in her mind, sharp and impossible to silence. "You are not the first to feign innocence in this house." Since then the halls had grown colder, doors closed more quickly, eyes avoided hers. Her letters remained unanswered. She no longer wandered the corridors, no longer sat in the library, no longer waited for the gentle tap at her door that never came. Instead, she stayed in her room, still and quiet, like a breath held too long. But pain, when left to fester, becomes movement. And on that storm-lashed evening, with the winds rattling the pains and grief sitting heavily in her chest, Bridget made a choice that was neither logical nor safe. It was human. She fled. She did not wait for sunrise. She did not send a note. She did not ask permission or seek forgiveness. She slipped through the servants' passage in her riding cloak, mounted the chestnut mare she had ridden once before, and galloped into the storm like a woman chased by ghosts. Rain soaked her veilless hair, plastered it to her neck and cheeks. Her boots slipped in the stirrups. Her dress caught the brambles as she raced along the narrow path that wound past the orchard and toward the low woods beyond the village. She did not know where she was going, only that she could not stay. The trees bent low against the wind, leaves whipped across her vision. Lightning flashed through the canopy, revealing shadows that danced like memories. The world was all blur and motion, a breathless ache inside her ribs. Then came the crack. A bolt of lightning struck a tree just off the trail. The sound, violent, monstrous, spooked the mare. She reared with a shriek, her hooves slicing the air, and Bridget, slick with rain, lost her grip. The fall was sudden, a snap of reins, a cry of pain, then silence. Bridget landed hard, her body twisting as it met the ground. Mud swallowed her hands, stones bit her hip. Her vision went white with impact and then dimmed to grey. She lay still, the rain falling over her, soaking through her clothes, her breath coming in ragged gasps. One leg throbbed with a deep pulsing pain. Her hair fanned out across the wet earth like ivy, and her fingers curled into fists, not out of strength, but from instinct. She tried to rise. She could not. The forest, once alive with storm, now pressed close and cold. Her limbs trembled, her lips parted to cry out, but the sound was lost to the wind. Then, footsteps. A voice. "Is that? Lord help us, it's her!" The villagers had seen the horse, riderless, galloping through the edge of the glen. They had followed, and now they gathered around her. 2 men, 1 older woman, kneeling, murmuring, shielding her from the rain with their cloaks. "She's hurt. Go, fetch Father Colum." Oh no, by the time the priest arrived, she was slipping in and out of consciousness, her skin cold, her face pale. "Bridget," he said, cradling her head, "child, stay with me." Her lashes fluttered. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. "We've got you now. You're not alone." They carried her to a nearby cottage. A fire was lit. Dry blankets wrapped around her. Herbal tinctures were placed near the hearth to warm. She drifted in and out of sleep, lost in a haze of pain and memory. The cross, the veil, the letters, Seamus's voice, the weight of being unseen, then doubted again. And somewhere, beyond the walls of the storm, a reckoning was unfolding. Back at Rathmore, Seamus had been returning from a late inspection of the tenant cottages when the news reached him. His steward approached, rain streaming from his hat, breathless. My lord, the chestnut mare. She returned without a rider. For a moment, Seamus did not move. The words did not register. They floated there, suspended in the air like ash. Then, where? The south path, toward the glen. He did not ask for a cloak. He did not wait for a horse. He ran. Through mud, through rain, through darkness, he ran like a man pursued by his own soul. The storm lashed at him. Branches tore at his coat. His boots sank deep into the sodden earth. But none of it mattered. Only one thought burned in his chest. Brigid, his Brigid. He had failed her. Again. The priest's cottage stood dim and flickering at the forest's edge. When he reached it, soaked to the bone and gasping for breath, Father Colum met him at the door. She's inside. She's alive but bruised. We believe her leg may be sprained. Seamus pushed past him, his eyes wild with anguish. She lay on a makeshift bed near the fire, her hair damp, her hands pale against the coarse blanket. Her face was turned away, lips parted in sleep. Her chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm. He dropped to his knees beside her, his clothes heavy with rain and guilt. "Brigid," he breathed. "My God!" His hand hovered over hers, trembling. Then, softly, her eyes opened. She blinked, took in the light, the shape beside her. And then she saw him. No mask, no coldness, no distance, only a man broken by the sight of her. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm here now." She tried to speak. He shook his head gently, his fingers brushing her cheek with reverence. "You don't need to say anything." "Not yet." Tears gathered in his eyes. Fell. "I was wrong. I doubted what I never had the right to question." He leaned closer, his voice catching. "You are the only truth I've ever feared losing." She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze steady despite the pain, and then finally she let go. Her body relaxed, her eyes closed, and she collapsed. Not from injury, but into his arms. And there, in the heart of the storm, among mud and firelight, past and silence, she was held. Not as a burden, not as a wife by contract, but as a woman finally seen, and never again unseen. The storm had passed, but its weight still lingered over Rathmore Hall, not in thunder or rain, but in silence. The kind of silence that comes after a confession, after a wound has been exposed and the skin still trembles from the sting of truth. Seamus Rathmore returned alone that morning, his boots thick with dried mud, his coat damp from the journey back. The priest had offered him shelter after Brigid had fallen asleep, but he had refused. He could not rest, not until the house that bore his name, the house that had buried his heart, was finally forced to breathe again. He crossed the threshold, not as a lord, but as a man unraveling. The servants kept their distance. Word of Lady Brigid's fall had spread quietly, and the maids and footmen moved with careful steps, unsure of what they were now witnessing between their master and the woman he had once kept at arm's length. Seamus did not speak. He climbed the staircase slowly, pausing outside the door of the east wing. The air was heavy there, still thick with the scent of disuse and something older. Grief, long since sealed behind oak and stone. He reached for the key. It had not left his pocket in 5 years. 5 years of pretending, 5 years of silence, 5 years of guilt so deeply etched into his bones that he no longer knew where the man ended and the memory began. The key turned with resistance, reluctant after years of rest. The door creaked open, groaning like a reluctant mourner, and the cold air within rushed past him like a sigh of the dead. He entered. The chamber was just as he had left it. Shrouds of linen covered the furniture, dust coated every surface. The windows were still shuttered, blocking out the light. It smelled of dried lavender and thyme. He moved to the fireplace. The hearth had long gone cold. On the mantel sat a small wooden box, carved with a delicate floral pattern, its edges worn soft. Inside, he knew, were the last letters Maeve had written him, letters he had read and reread until the words no longer felt like hers, only echoes of a life he could not reclaim. He sat beside the hearth and opened the box. One by one, he unfolded the pages. Her handwriting was soft, fluid, her words kind, forgiving, but they did not comfort him anymore. They bound him. He fed the first letter to the fire he had built himself, watching as the flame caught the edge and consumed it slowly, curling the ink into black lace. The second followed, then the third. With each page, his chest grew tighter, and then lighter. The last letter trembled in his hand. It had been her final message, written before he'd left for Ulster, a letter of promises, of plans, of dreams never lived. He pressed it to his lips. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Then he let it burn. He remained there until every page had turned to ash, the room now lit by a flame that seemed warmer than any he'd felt in years. The shadows no longer moved like ghosts. They rested. Only then did he move to the windows and open the shutters. Light burst into the chamber. Dust danced in the beams, like tiny spirits released from purgatory, and for the first time in half a decade, the room breathed. Seamus pulled the linen shrouds from the furniture, one by one, the dressing table, the armchair, the cradle. He paused at the cradle. His hand trembled as he touched the edge, but he did not pull away. He simply bowed his head, not to grief, but to release. When he left the chamber, the door remained unlocked. The house did not fight him anymore. That afternoon, he entered Bridget's chamber for the first time since her return. She lay resting, her leg bound with linen, her face turned toward the window where the late sun filtered through gauze curtains. Her hair had dried into soft waves across her pillow, and the bruising on her temple was fading to a shadow. He stood beside her in silence. Then, carefully, he set something on the table near her bed. Her veil. She stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, and upon seeing him did not flinch. They held his gaze with quiet strength. "I burned them," he said. "The letters. I opened the room. I let the light in." She watched him. "I don't want you hidden," he continued. "Not behind duty. Not behind silence. Not behind me." He picked up the veil, holding it gently between his hands. "You may wear it," he said softly, "or never again. It is your choice now." Her throat tightened, but she did not cry. She reached for the veil with steady hands and placed it on the table beside her, untouched. "No more hiding," she said. A breath escaped him, not quite a sigh, not quite a sob. That evening they dined together in the candle-lit dining hall. There were no long silences, no strained glances, no echoes of roles once played. Seamus sat beside her, not across. Their hands rested on the table, close but not yet touching. Bridget wore a gown of soft plum velvet, her hair pinned with a silver comb. Her veil remained in her room, folded and left behind. Her posture was graceful, but no longer defensive. She no longer looked like a guest unsure of her welcome. She looked like a woman who belonged. The food was warm, simple, real. He asked her about the villagers. She asked him about the fields. They spoke of trivial things and then of memories, his, hers, shared, and not yet shared. When the final course was cleared, he stood and offered her his hand. She took it. They walked through the gallery, past the portraits of his ancestors, past the wide windows now misted with evening fog. No words passed between them, only breath, only presence. And when he turned to face her, the firelight catching the silver at his temples, she saw not the man she had married out of necessity, but the man who had chosen to become something more. He raised his hand slowly, cupping her cheek. "You are not what I deserved," he whispered. She smiled faintly. "Perhaps not. But I'm here." He leaned in, and for the first time their lips met. No audience, no veil, no uncertainty, just warmth, just truth. A kiss that was not stolen or imposed, but earned. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, breathing in the closeness like air after a long drowning. "I don't want a quiet bride," he said, voice low. She blinked up at him, her breath trembling. "I want you." And in the hush that followed, there was no longer space between them. Their marriage, once cold and calculated, had become a sanctuary, a place neither of them had believed they'd find. Not in this life. And yet, here they stood, whole, together, at last. The days that followed Bridget's recovery unfolded like parchment warming beneath the sun, slow, careful, unfolding at their own pace. Rathmore Hall, once a place of echoing halls and shuttered grief, now brimmed with quiet activity. Servants no longer whispered when Bridget passed. They greeted her with bowed heads and soft admiration. The house had accepted her, not because she bore the Earl's name, but because she had carved her place within its stone walls, not with force, but with grace. It was the second week of June, and the gardens had burst into colour. Lavender hummed with bees, rose bushes bloomed with extravagant pride, and ivy crept along the west walls as though trying to draw closer to her window. She walked the grounds each morning unveiled, her face kissed by the pale Irish sun, her steps light but certain. They called her the quiet flame of Rathmore in the village, the girl who had once worn mourning like a second skin and now moved through the world lit from within. In the study, the Earl of Rathmore sat behind a polished desk, hands steepled, listening. Across from him stood Father Colum O'Shea, his expression grave, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. The priest unfolded the letters slowly, laying them on the desk one by one. "All of them," he said, "written by Lady Newler." Seamus leaned forward. The handwriting mimicked Bridget's almost perfectly, curved and delicate, designed to wound with subtlety. Words of calculated flirtation, false confessions, pleas that she might someday claim more than what was hers. He recognized now what he should have questioned long ago. "She forged these?" he asked, voice low. "She bribed the maid who delivered the correspondence," Father Colum confirmed. "I only learned of it when the girl confessed during confession and begged forgiveness. She said Newler offered her passage to London and coin if she kept silent." Seamus's hand curled into a fist. "She did all this while pretending to safeguard Bridget's virtue. She feared the girl would take what she herself could not possess," the priest said gently. Seamus stood, the tension in his shoulders no longer grief, but protective fury. He had nearly destroyed what was blooming between him and Bridget, all because of a woman who could not bear to be forgotten. "She will not set foot here again," he said. And true to his word, Lady Newler was escorted back to London, her reputation in tatters. Seamus made no public statement. He did not need to. In a society that prized appearances, Newler's absence, her abrupt departure, and the quiet disdain that followed were punishment enough. Bridget never asked what had been discovered. She did not need vengeance to feel victorious. Her triumph was not measured in Newler's disgrace, but in the way the household now opened its doors to her, in the way the Earl reached for her hand without hesitation. The evening of the midsummer feast arrived, golden and breathless. Long tables had been set up in the outer courtyard, draped in crisp white linen and adorned with cut flowers from the estate gardens. Lanterns hung from iron posts, flickering with warm candlelight as twilight descended, casting a honeyed glow across the stone and ivy. Bridget stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping out. She wore a gown of deep blue velvet, the colour of a night sky, moments before the stars appear. The sleeves were modest, fitted to her slender arms, and the neckline curved gently across her collarbone, adorned with a single brooch of silver filigree. Her hair, no longer confined in tight braids or hidden beneath veils, cascaded in soft waves, half-pinned with ivory combs gifted by one of the village girls. She wore no veil, and when she stepped beside Seamus, it was not as his acquisition, his duty, or his sorrow, but as his equal. The villagers paused when they saw her, then smiled, raising their cups. There were no cheers, no grand declarations, just the sound of respect, born from quiet admiration. Children ran past her skirts. An old woman touched her hand and whispered, "Bless you, Countess." A stable boy slipped her a handful of wildflowers, his cheeks red from courage. And then came the music. A fiddler began to play beneath the lanterns, and one by one, couples drifted onto the stone floor, polished smooth by years of footsteps. Bridget stood at the edge, her hands folded, watching. Seamus turned to her. "May I?" he asked. She gave him her hand. They moved slowly into the circle of light, surrounded by warmth and the scent of roses in full bloom. Their steps were measured at first, gentle, cautious. But then came the rhythm, the closeness, the awareness of breath, the brush of her fingers along his shoulder, the subtle tightening of his grip on her waist. They no longer danced for show, but in a language neither of them had spoken before. She looked up at him. He leaned close, his lips just beside her ear. "You were never cursed, Bridget," he murmured, "only hidden." She did not answer. She did not need to. The veil was gone. The lie that had bound her burned away with every gesture, every glance. Later, long after the music faded and the stars shimmered above them like blessings scattered from the heavens, they stood beneath the branches of the old ash tree, the same one visible from the drawing-room window. The lanterns had dimmed. The guests had returned to the great hall. Only they remained. She pressed a hand to his chest, where the steady rhythm of his heart spoke louder than words. He took her hand and kissed her knuckles, then held it against his cheek. "This place was built for men who bore crowns of stone," he said. "But you've turned it into a place that breathes. And you," she said softly, "are no longer the man who walks with ghosts." He laughed gently, a sound she had only heard twice before. "I think I only ever lived in shadows," he whispered, "until you opened the window." And so they stood, wrapped in the hush of midsummer night, no longer captives of grief, no longer veiled by duty or silence. Bridget O'Callaghan, once cursed and cloaked in mourning, stood not as a girl rescued or redeemed, but as the countess in her own right. The flame had never consumed her, it had shaped her, and now, at last, she burned with her own light. The year was now 1603, and the air in Rathmore carried a different weight, lighter, warmer, touched by the quiet assurance of peace earned through storm and sorrow. The estate, once a citadel of silence and spectres, had become a place of laughter and gentle rhythm, where seasons came and went with purpose, not dread. The villagers still called her the quiet flame of Rathmore, but it was no longer whispered with awe or mystery. It was spoken with affection. Children recited her name in games, and mothers invoked her strength in bedtime stories. She had become something more than a countess. She had become a symbol of grace, of defiance, of love that endured after the veils fell and the ashes settled. Bridget O'Callaghan Rathmore now walked the halls not as a stranger in borrowed silk, but as a woman who had claimed every stone with the steady beat of her heart. The portraits of ancestral lords still hung in the gallery, but beside them now was a new canvas, a family painted in warm tones, set against the gardens that had once only known silence. At her side stood Seamus, changed and unchanged. The weight he had carried for so long, grief, duty, regret, had softened around the edges. He still wore darkness well, his coats, his moods, his silences, but now he reached for Bridget's hand in the mornings. Now he laughed, quietly but genuinely, when his daughter pulled at his cloak or when his son insisted on leading the prayer before supper. Yes, they had children. 2. A girl named Eilis, born with her mother's quiet eyes and her father's iron will, and a boy, Cian, whose hair curled like flame and who could not be still for more than a heartbeat. The nursery was filled with song and spilled ink, with tiny shoes left at the hearth and wooden toys carved by Seamus himself in the rare moments when politics did not call him to Dublin. Father Colum still visited, though his steps had slowed. He often sat by the garden wall, watching Eilis chase butterflies while Bridget embroidered in the shade. His voice remained steady, but his hands trembled now as he lifted the chalice during Mass. "The Lord gives, and the Lord tests," he would murmur, watching Bridget and Seamus exchange glances from across the pews. And in this house, he has done both. The estate had grown under Bridget's touch. She had restructured the tenant system, introduced fairer wages, and opened a small schoolhouse on the edge of the village, named in honor of Bridget the Younger, her grandmother. Women came to her for guidance. Young men sought her blessing before proposing to their sweethearts. She listened to them all, but not all names were remembered with warmth. Lady Nuala had returned to London disgraced, her schemes exposed. The scandal of forged letters, manipulation and cruelty had reached the ears of court. She tried to wed again, but no suitor remained for long. With her fortune diminished and her reputation ruined, she lived in the quiet margins of society, a woman once formidable, now forgotten. It was said she often stared at the fire for hours, muttering names no one else remembered. Bridget never spoke of her, not out of hatred, but because some wounds were best left to heal without reopening. Nuala had paid a price, not with death, but with irrelevance. On the fourth midsummer since that first unveiled dance, the feast at Rathmore was grander than ever. The air smelled of honeysuckle and roasted lamb, and the lanterns swayed in rhythm with the music. Servants mingled with tenants. Laughter rose from every table. Bridget stood beneath the same ash tree where Seamus had once whispered, "You were never cursed, only hidden." Now his words echoed again as he approached her, holding their daughter in one arm, their son at his side. "You still burn, Bridget," he said, brushing a curl from her brow. "And you still see me," she answered. He smiled. "Now the whole world does." As the music played and the stars emerged above the Irish countryside, Bridget looked out at her home, her people, her children, and the man who had once given her nothing but shadows and now offered her every sunrise. Love, she had learned, was not the fire that consumed, but the one that endured. And so, beneath the lanterns and the wide summer sky, the flame at Rathmore kept burning, gentle, steadfast, and everlasting. Sometimes a veil is not made of lace or silk, it is made of silence, fear, or the shadows others cast upon us. Bridget's story is a powerful reminder that our worth is not defined by what others try to hide, but by the courage we summon to step into the light. Through heartbreak, betrayal, and storms, both real and emotional, she found her voice, her strength, and above all, a love that saw her, not for what she was told to be, but for who she truly was. If her journey touched your heart, if her resilience sparked something in your soul, we invite you to leave the word "unveiled" in the comments. That will let us know you stayed until the very end, and that Bridget's transformation resonated deeply with you. If you believe in the power of these stories and want to support the creative team behind them, you can now send a super thanks right here on YouTube. Any amount, large or small, helps us continue bringing these emotional period dramas to life. And if you're not able to contribute financially, sharing this story with a friend is a beautiful way to help more people discover it. Every gesture counts. Before you go, don't forget to check the other stories we've left in the cards at the end of the video. Tales just as romantic, intense, and unforgettable as Bridget and Seamus's. Thank you for being here. Thank you for feeling with us. And above all, thank you for remembering that even the quietest flame can light an entire world.